The thing about betrayal is that it never screams, it whispers. It hides in glances, in the way someone's voice changes when they say your name, in the faint scent of a stranger's cologne that shouldn't be there. I didn't want to believe it. I refused to. But deep down, I knew. It started with late nights. Just work, she'd say, brushing her hair into a bun and walking out the door before I could even kiss her goodbye. At first, I was proud of her ambition, her drive, her hunger for something more, but soon, that hunger stopped being about work. One night, I came home early. The lights were dim, the air heavy like the house itself was holding its breath. Her phone was on the counter, buzzing every few minutes. Curiosity isn't what kills you, it's the truth you find when you finally give in. The name flashing on her screen was Daniel. The messages were short, intimate, coded in ways that only lovers understand. You made me crazy last night. Can't stop thinking about you. You'll never know. That last one hit harder than any punch I'd ever taken. I stood there, the blood pounding in my ears, the world spinning. My wife, the woman I'd loved for 10 years, was lying to my face. When she walked in later that night, smiling, humming, acting as if nothing was wrong, I said nothing. I just stared. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone so casual it burned. "Yeah," I said softly. "Everything's perfect." But inside, something had already started to burn. A slow, quiet fire. The next morning, I drove to the office early. I didn't eat, didn't sleep. I just watched the minutes pass, each one sharpening me into something colder. I started to collect things, small, insignificant details, receipts, texts, schedules. I learned where he worked, where he lived, where they met. And then I started thinking, if they wanted a secret so badly, what would happen if I became the secret they couldn't hide from? That's the thing about revenge. It doesn't come from anger. It comes from silence, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you patient. By the end of the week, I knew everything. The hotel, the time, the room number. And when I stood outside that door, listening to the laughter behind it, my hands didn't shake. They'd taken everything from me, my trust, my pride, my peace. Now, I was going to take everything back, but not with violence. Not yet. No. This would be slow. This would be art. Because the best revenge isn't about breaking someone, it's about watching them destroy themselves. If you asked me in the months after that night what I wanted most, I would have said two things: for them to feel the exact fracture they put in me, and for the world to watch them fall apart like a sculpture that's lost its base. I wanted spectacle without spectacle, the collapse so complete it felt ordained. I didn't plot in a fever. I drew a map. First, the pattern. People who cheat hide in routine, the same coffee shop, the same weekend getaway, the same excuses. I traced their timetable until it looked like a route on an old atlas, the stops and margins, places where they believed themselves invisible. The hotel receipts were there. So were the timestamps. So was the way they always left 5 minutes before closing, assuming the world would not notice. Second, the allies. Revenge isn't a solo sport. You need pieces that move without you. I thought about every person they'd wronged, the colleague he'd pushed out, the contractor who'd never been paid for a rushed weekend job, the barista who overheard their voices and remembered faces. I made calls like a man arranging chairs at a funeral, a gentle, necessary, confidential. Most people agreed immediately. Most people want to be righted. Most people want a system that will make the guilty accountable. Third, the weapon. I didn't want to smear them with lies. I wanted to present truth like a mirror with razor edges. I hired someone to sift through their digital lives, quietly, metadata, backups, cloud logs. Let the hackers with flashy names take the headlines. I paid for methodical work. For a week, I breathed in their history. For a week, I watched every message bloom into a pattern. The more I had, the surer I felt. Then came the theater of it. Revenge tastes better when served with precision. I started small, the way a surgeon starts, a minor incision, a probe under the skin. An anonymous package to his office, a printout of a receipt he'd hoped was only visible to the two of them. A glossy photo slipped under a board member's door, of the kind with corner folds like someone had been in a hurry. A quiet email to his investor titled "Urgent Possible Conflict of Interest. Please review attached." People in power panic less at accusations than at the hint of risk. Money is cowardly that way. Within days, his calendar was full of urgent and sensitive meetings. He smiled and deflected, but smiles are theater. I watched him from a distance, counted the times he checked his phone in public, the way his hand trembled when he thought no one would notice. The social attacks came next. I knew the friends who liked to gossip and the ones who kept quiet until they smelled a story. I fit certain names carefully, the photo here, a text there. Nothing that could be legally pinned to me, but enough that a rumor would sprout. Rumor is a living thing. It spreads best when nurtured with plausible details. For every conversation they had in quiet corners, another pair of ears would now be listening. But the sweetest strategy was psychological. People who cheat live in a curated world. They sanitize reality until the truth is inconvenient. So, I eroded edges of their comfort. I'd make sure their calls went unanswered at critical moments. I'd send fake confirmation emails for meetings that didn't exist, and watch the scramble when they showed up with nothing. I'd leak small documents to the right people, an expense report here, an invoice there, until patterns aligned and became undeniable. And all the while I wore the mask. I kept being the devoted spouse, the man who forgave, the one who pretended to sleep while the house hummed with the lie he now kept. Outwardly, I was the wounded husband who loved and wanted to understand. Inside, I was a clockmaker, setting gears, winding springs, and waiting for the right midnight. There were nights I nearly lost it. When I saw them together laughing in a photo I'd forced into being public, something in me wanted to smash glass and scream. I didn't. The plan was not to explode. It was to suffocate them with consequences. Their arrogance had been their armor. I sharpened every instrument that would pierce it. I also prepared for the aftermath. How do you survive victory? How do you not become the very monster you've been hunting? I wrote contingencies. I moved finances. I documented everything. If they tried to swing the narrative back at me, I wanted a ledger so clean the world would not entertain their claims. I wasn't naive. I knew they would shout, "Lawyer, accuse." So, I made sure every step I took could be defended as truth. Then I struck the first real public chord, a soft message to a respected journalist I knew, framed as a reader tip. It was factual, dry, and horrifying in its ordinariness. The journalist didn't run to headlines, he asked for documents. When documents are stitched to the face of a story, narratives collapse. Within 72 hours, the first article appeared online, precise, calm, and heavy with implication. Evan called me that night. He was careful in his words, but the crack in his voice was a confession. "I can explain," he said. The old reflex, the old charisma. I listened and let his senses fold back on themselves. He offered excuses that once would have charmed me. I heard them the way you hear a clock ticking in an empty room, predictable, inevitable, and maddeningly patient. On my map, we were approaching the point of no return. The dominoes were set. The public had its seed of doubt. The board had its whispers. His personal life began to curdle. Friends who'd once sat close now kept awkward distances. The hotel desk clerk I paid off told the right person that records were available. The barista who'd seen them together agreed to give a statement. The more they ran, the more my net tightened. By the time the first investigator knocked on his office door, I hadn't felt victory yet. There was only the strange, vacant sense you get when something monumental has been scheduled and the clock has started counting down. The plan was working. The life he'd built on charm and theft was coming apart and seems too deliberate to blame on fate. I had expected to feel triumph then. Instead, I felt the cold, crystalline clarity of a man who had traded love for a ledger and found that the numbers were not enough to warm a heart turned to stone. The map was accurate, the route was set, and my hand was steady on the wheel as I watched them make the wrong turns, one by one. They told me once that when you throw enough stones at a pane of glass, it starts to remember the cracks. The first impact is nothing but sound you could chalk up to the wind, and then the Fisher spider, outward until the whole thing refuses to hold back what's inside. When the journalist published the first piece, clinical, citation heavy, a surgical dismantling of Evan's public narrative, the office did not explode. It imploded. People folded their hands around their coffee cups and read the paragraphs like scripture. The comments thread branched off into 1,000 small judgments, and every what if nudged someone into asking for receipts. That was my cue. I walked into the company that morning and felt the atmosphere like static on my skin. Colleagues avoided the corridor that led to his office. The elevator ride took on the quiet of a funeral procession. He met my eyes once, from across the atrium. And it was like seeing a man caught mid-fall of surprise and calculation mixed into a face he tried to rearrange into composure. The board moved first the way institutions always do, with administrative apathy disguised as protocol. A formal request for documents here, a temporary suspension there. They were careful, so careful as to be cruel. They used phrases like due diligence and protecting stakeholder value, 20 words to do the work of a sledgehammer. Evan fought like a cornered animal. He called investors in the night, sent emails that read like confessions with apologies tacked on. He begged mercifully for time, for grace, for a window to fix a life he had hurried into ruin. He sent his PR team into the trenches to script messages that would soothe pain with corporate cadence. It didn't work. Once the ledger corrodes trust, words are only bandages. The first time someone asked me in a meeting whether I had anything to add, I almost laughed at the absurd theater of it. Then I swallowed and spoke the way a man diffuses a bomb. Factual, tempered, unemotional. I laid out timelines, but not with glee, with boredom. There is an efficiency to truth that repels melodrama. My role had always been executioner and surgeon, and in that moment I felt both, with none of the frivolous cruelty I had once imagined. This was business. This was survival. This was correction. I watched him break not in spectacular scenes but in polite concessions. A vendor sent a scanned receipt that didn't match the company's public record. An email thread surfaced that showed an unauthorized approval. A contractor produced a canceled check deposited into an account that led to a name nobody liked to speak aloud. Each revelation was a pebble. Each pebble loosened his foothold. He started to lose friends. Not in dramatic confrontations but in appointment slips. Can't make it tonight. Got to handle something. Out of office personal emergency. Invitations stopped. People who had once reveled in his company now pretended they had never been enthralled. It's a strange and specific kind of loneliness to watch someone you loved like a brother become someone people politely step around. At home, the quiet war turned personal. Emma's eyes shifted between husband and scandal, and for a time she seemed suspended, fearful, ashamed, and sure of which self she wanted to keep. I could see the weight of it bending her shoulders. She had built a lie of convenience, and now the lie was producing consequences that weren't all easily shipped away. Some nights I found myself awake, watching the ceiling fan spin, thinking about the cost ledger I'd started that first week. With every name I pulled at, another face flickered into my mind: interns who trusted him, parents who had invested retirement savings, a child's college fund that might have relied on a promise. My plan had been to punish the betrayers, but punishment pours, and it floods basements that once slipped dry. There was a moment, in the middle of this machinery, that cut deeper than any article or audit. Evan stumbled into the building on a Tuesday, hair uncombed, eyes shadowed, and he saw me in a hallway and said one word that landed like an accusation and an apology all at once: why? The question was simple. I could have met it with the ledger, the evidence, the receipts, the photographs, but I answered in the only way that made sense to me then, with the memory of how it felt to wake up betrayed. Because you chose to take us apart, I said. Because you decided my work was a ladder you'd climb. His face tightened, a map folding inward. He tried to barter after that, with promises, with cries for mercy, and when that failed he started to tell himself new stories to stay sane. He told people he'd been scapegoated, that success breeds enemies who invent narratives. He sought solace in a few loyalists who'd drink with him on quiet nights and say words he wanted to hear. But when the auditors came with subpoenas and the board asked for a suspension, charm could not patch the holes the ledger had made. The media cycle chewed and moved on eventually, as it always does. But the damage it left was not headline-sized. It was the slow deterioration of trust. Contracts that once signed themselves required re-examining. Meetings that had been scheduled with enthusiasm became inspection sessions. A man who had been anointed on platforms and podcasts was reduced to a name on a legal memo trail. Practical, efficient. I did not dance on the ruins. There was no pleasure in watching him call his mother from a payphone, voice raw, asking how to explain his life's unmaking. There was only a hollow compliance. I had wanted restitution, and I had engineered it. The ledger balanced. The evidence sat like a tray of clean instruments. The city had shifted. But as I walked home those nights, the victory felt like a borrowed coat, Warm against the wind, but stiff and unfamiliar. There were nights I wondered if I had the right to be both God and judge. I wondered if the fury that had fed my actions would always be collateral in someone else's quiet life. The question did not make me stop. It changed the tone. It made the next moves quieter, more careful, because once you've broken a man's world, you inherit his ghosts, and ghosts have a way of circling back to the living. The world has a way of answering you back. For months I'd fed it facts and let it spit consequences in coffee-stained memos and boardroom minutes. But there's a point where the echo gets louder than the voice that started it, when the damage you intended begins to ricochet in directions you hadn't drawn on your map. Evan's collapse stopped being private. The board's internal review leaked. Headlines threaded through LinkedIn like a vicious rumor. Executive under investigation. Vendor irregularities. Company image at stake. Investors who once phoned with compliments started calling about exposure. The people who'd taken his calls only yesterday now left voicemails that tasted like distance. And everywhere I went, I carried the weight of my own work. People looked at me differently. Some with a nod of respect, some with the thin, polite curiosity reserved for men who'd been through a crucible. I answered interviewers with a calm I'd practiced until it wasn't acting anymore. But inside, the engine kept running, louder than the applause and the news cycles, the ledger, the timeline. The small humiliations I'd catalogued. Evan's personal world split like glass under pressure. Megan, the woman who'd smiled against my face and whispered promises in the dark, stopped returning his texts. There are breaks that happen because the public no longer wants to be complicit. And there are breaks that happen because the private conscience buckles. He spent nights on the couch, phone face down. The man trying to bargain with a life that had become a problem said he could not solve. At the same time, the office became an ecosystem for quiet violence. People I'd once considered allies paused when I passed them in the hallway, eyes flicking to the floor as if politeness required a little distance after scandal. Contracts stalled not because clients were cruel, but because the business had to look prudent. Cash flows get picky when reputations wobble. Banks call about terms. The small ripples became swells. The company moved like a ship trimming sails for a storm. Then the legal letters began. Not the dramatic subpoenas you see on TV, but the patient, polite letters from counsel that folded through inboxes like winter. They asked for records. They asked for the origin of notes and chain of custody. My phone buzzed with requests I was prepared for, and I answered them with the same flat honesty I had used all along. I have created clean channels for my proof because the truth, presented without theatrics, folds a room in on itself. But there was a cost I hadn't fully accounted for: collateral human pain. Interns who'd idolized Evan texted me from the stairwell, trying to understand whether their mentorship had been a farce. A facilities manager asked if she'd keep her job. She had a child to feed. I listened to the quiet human accounts that made the ledger heavier, names that had nothing to do with treachery but everything and to do with livelihoods. Every name was a stone I'd set in motion. Remorse isn't dramatic. It's a persistent tick under the ribs. Evan responded in the only ways he could charm, frayed into apologies that tasted like inventory lists, denials that read like legal counsel scripts, and finally, a kind of desperate honesty in the dark. He found me once after a late meeting, standing under the atrium skylight, and he said, voice thin, "Do you remember when we used to dream about this, about how we'd change things?" He looked around like he couldn't find the house he'd built. "I remember," I said. The answer was all the weapon he needed, and I didn't want him to have proof that memory can be both a bridge and an indictment. He begged, not theatrically, but with the bare, pleading cadence of someone who'd lost the choreography of his life. "Tell them the truth," he whispered. "I'll fix it. We can fix it." Those two syllables sounded childish in the echo of everything that had already been done. Sometimes, in the small hours when the city smelled like rain and urgency, I replayed the exact moment I'd first found her messages. The hot shock, the silence that followed. I measured it against the evidence I'd now given to an indifferent world. The scales balanced with a coldness I barely recognized, justice on one side, ugliness on the other. The line between the two thinned. At a staff meeting, a junior analyst I'd mentored asked a question that cut closer than any headline. If you had the choice, would you do it again? My answer came like a storm I hadn't prepared for. I thought of the nights I'd poured over timestamps until dawn, the nights I'd pretended to sleep while my life was being stolen, the faces of people who had been collateral. "I don't know," I said. The room inhaled and then moved on, but the question threaded through me like a splinter. And then something unexpected happened. Someone started watching me back. A quiet person, the contractor whose payment schedule had been complicated by Evan's deals, left a small envelope on my car. Inside, a single photograph of a man shaking hands with a woman at a gala, my face visible in the reflection of the glass behind them. On the back, in shorthand, "You pulled the threads. Who watches the weaver?" No signature, no threat, just a mirror, handed to me in the daylight. The message unsettled me. For the first time since I made the first call, I felt a prickle of exposure, as if my craftsmanship had its own trail. I had always assumed that truth, when gathered and presented, was armor. But armor rusts, evidence leaks. People see patterns and look for the hand that set them in motion. There were nights I imagined a reckoning that came for me, journalists turning their lights in my direction. The same pundits who applauded my restraint now asking whether I'd grown monstrous. It's an odd terror to fear the reflection of your own strategy. The thing you become in pursuit of justice can look a lot like the thing you hated. By the time the regulatory letters switched to formal inquiries, my victories had teeth. Evan's name was removed from the company website. His office was cleared in the early morning while the elevators hummed with process. He left a note on a desk nobody would touch and went away. The city had taken its cut, but the echo, the human echo, the ones I hadn't lined into spreadsheets, kept rising. Friends didn't call as often. Children's school fundraisers went quiet. The contractor who'd left the photograph now avoided my gaze in the supply yard. I began to understand that ruins don't belong to a single owner. They scatter across neighborhoods, across dinner tables, across inboxes. Late one night, as rain freckled the windshield, I drove to the shoreline. I sat with the engine off and let the sea sound claim the world for a while. There, with waves moving like slow breath, I admitted something simple and terrible to myself. I had set a course, and it had run true. But in doing so I had become someone patient, precise, and ultimately hardened. The man who had wanted to cleave a wound in the world had found himself standing inside the hollow he'd made. The next day there would be more hearings, more meetings, more small phone calls that carried the weight of people's lives. But in the quiet after the storm, when the city's lights blinked and the headlines cooled, I had to live with the sound that followed my work. The echoes. They were louder than any applause, and colder than any revenge. When the last subpoena came, it arrived in a fat envelope with the same polite language as everything else in this life. "We request your voluntary cooperation." The bureaucratic softness of it made me laugh once. Low and strange, because nothing about what had happened to us had been voluntary. By then, the world had already decided. Evan was gone, not in the theatrical way I'd sometimes imagined, but then, like a rumor fading into the city's static. Contracts were rewritten, his advisors replaced, his name scrubbed from pages and plates until the memory of him felt like distant hail. The board held a meeting and chose survival. The press filed columns and moved on. The headlines were short-lived. The consequences were not. The collapse had a moral gravity all its own. People I'd fought beside, people whose loyalty I'd once assumed, asked me questions in gentle tones that carried guilt. "Did you see any other way?" said one, folding his hands as if he were confessing to himself. A contractor I'd given money to for his silence met my eyes and didn't say the word I needed to hear, sorry, but the look carried it anyway. Apologies are the coins of salvage. Sometimes they don't buy enough. In the weeks that followed, small things happened that had nothing to do with strategy. A local barista who knew me by name refused to put my usual drink on the counter, sliding it to me sideways like a secret. An intern I'd tried to mentor sent an email thanking me for what I'd done but confessing that the cost had been harder to carry than she'd expected. Lives ripple outward. The ledger you balance has entries you didn't list. There was one call I did not expect. The number was foreign, or at least felt foreign, like a voice from another life. "You did what you had to do," a soft man said. "But remember, ruins make real estate for other men's fires." He hung up. No name, no threat, just a warning, like a final line drawn in the sand. That night I went back to the hotel where they'd met, of the place that had been a dot on my map and a hinge in my life. The lobby smelled of lemons and old money. The clerk barely blinked. I stood where I'd listened at a door months before and imagined the sound that had once been laughter, a memory with teeth. For a second I thought I might feel vindicated, or relieved, or final. Instead I felt like someone who had exchanged one language for another. I had traded grief for calculation, and calculation was colder than any pain. Then the message came, not a legal notice, not a public statement, but a simple text. No flourish, no accusation, just the kind of sentence that lands a person with the weight of a stone and leaves a bruise you see for weeks. You were right to remember. You were wrong to become him. It was from an unknown number. My thumb hovered. I thought about replying, about confessing, about explaining how betrayal fragments you until there is no clear line between self and reaction. Then I put the phone down. Some conversations strip you of privacy. Some strip you of meaning. In the final days, the city's indifference was my constant companion. People returned to their routines with an efficiency that's almost violent. The world heals by forgetting. The firm traded scandal for stability, appointed a new face, and moved on. Investors smiled politely. The interns graduated on time. The contractor's child enrolled in school. Pieces were picked up, reattached, at a small cost most could live with. Me, I tasted victory like ash. For the first time since the map began, I allowed myself to look inward and measure the damage I'd done to my own edges. Revenge had not soothed the wound. It had scarred me in a way that was permanent and precise. I could see how my reflection now carried the same restless, efficient calculation I had always hated in Evan. One late afternoon, months after the last legal dust had settled, I found a photograph in a book I'd been leafing through, a candid shot of two boys on a rooftop from an old charity gala, laughing, one arm over the other's shoulder. I traced the grain of the paper with my thumb until my skin went numb. The image was a relic of a life that felt unreal now, like a film reel from a decade I could summon, but not re-inhabit. I called Emma. She answered on the second ring. Her voice held yours in a way neither of ours did before, softer, far away. "Are you okay?" she asked. The question was simple and honest, and it landed me in a place I hadn't planned on visiting, regret. "I don't know," I admitted. "Do you?" She laughed, a small brittle sound. "Some nights I do. Some nights I don't." There was a pause. "You destroyed him, you know." It wasn't a question. It was a statement that folded around both of us. "And you lost something in the process." We talked for a long time after that, not to repair, not to justify, only to name what we had each lost. We said the words people say when there is nothing left to defend. "I'm sorry. I was scared. I thought I was keeping you safe." None of those sentences solved a ledger. None of them paid any debt, but they were human. They were small and flawed and true. In the months that followed, I left the city for a while. I didn't run. I just needed distance, not from the headlines but from myself. I rented a cabin by a river that moved like a slow confession. At night, I sat with a notebook and wrote the sequence of everything I'd done and why. It was not a confession for any court. It was an inventory for myself, a ledger that would not be signed by anyone else. On the last page I wrote something I had not expected to say. I wanted justice. I got a verdict. But judges are strangers in cold rooms. They do not hold the bodies that lie beneath the sentences. I folded the paper and left it in the drawer like a relic. When I returned, people greeted me with a careful kindness I'd learned to take with caution. The firm offered me a desk back in a subsidiary role. Friends sent drinks and texts. Life sifted me into a place that looked normal. The scaffolding of community reassembled itself around the absence, as it always does. A year later, on an anniversary I'd once celebrated with fireworks, I drank a glass of wine alone. No triumph, no vengeance's drumbeat, just a steady, appraising quiet. Outside, the city's lights blinked like false stars. A bus went by, and someone laughed on the street. The world continued, a machine that did not weigh hearts and judgments the way I had. I sometimes think about the man I used to be, not the one who planned, but the one who loved without calculation, who trusted easily, who would forgive because forgiving was easier than harboring hurt. He seemed a stranger now, almost mythic. I don't know if he'll ever come back. What I do know is this: revenge is a transaction in which both parties pay a price. Maybe one day someone will ask me if it was worth it. I don't think there will be an answer I'm proud of. There will only be the ledger in my head and the quiet of the nights I spent learning how to be precise with pain. Sometimes, when the wind pushes cold and the river is loud and the world feels small and honest, I stand and listen. The silence answers in a way that no headline ever could. It doesn't give absolution. It doesn't fix the past. It only shows you the shape of what remains. And in that shape, I see small, dim things: a photograph on a rooftop, a voice on the other end of a line, the knowledge that you can take everything from someone and still be left wanting.